Okay, thank you, everybody. And Mark, this is your cue for getting the live stream started.
Already did.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, so we're always starting the YouTube live stream a little late for copyright issues with the sound recording. So as you know, I have already announced that this workshop will be recorded. You're of course free to put your camera off for this time being. And Mark, actually, I would ask you to pin me and Katharina. That would be fantastic. Thank you. And I will begin the recording now. Yeah, so for everybody who doesn't know me, I'm very happy that you're all here. My name is Nadezhda Taranchevsky, and I'm the co-founder of Conscious You. And in a nutshell, we're specialized in facilitating collective transformation through scalable online coaching programs. And my connection with money is that about 16 years ago, I met Peter Koenig, which many of you know, who has become my mentor around all things money. And I co-wrote an online coaching program with Peter called See You Money. And as part of our movement, or the movement that Peter founded, I have begun to run these money talks to just widen our conversations around money and have conversations with interesting people about all things money, in order to have more of a literacy around money, widen our perspective with money, and also just simply normalize our conversation, our dealing and handling of money. So our setup for today will be that I introduce our speaker, and unfortunately we don't have Ivan Caballero with us today. Frankly, he is missing in action. I don't know what happened. So my assumption is that something must have happened. As a friend of mine always keeps to say, when she doesn't show up for something, she says, because of reasons. So I'm assuming that Ivan has reasons. I will try to get him back at a later time. But it is my definite pleasure to introduce to you Katharina Gehra, who we will then have more time with today and be able to focus on her. So let me say a few things about Katharina. So Katharina is co-founder and managing director of the company Immutable GmbH, German company. And she belongs to the top 40 under 40, which is a ranking by the German business magazine Capital. And she has been nominated as an expert on the subject of blockchain for parliamentary hearings at the German Bundestag. And so Katharina has a lot more on her agenda and in her CV that we might touch as we are getting on with our conversation today. But for now, I would actually be delighted, Katharina, if you could say a few more personal things about yourself.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, Nadezhda, for this invitation, and I hope we'll fill the gap that even certainly will make, but I'm sure we'll find some intriguing content to fill that with. I think generally, to sum up, my previous career has been, one very traditional banking, consulting, private equity. Before 3 years ago, I decided to join the blockchain space. I did so quite deliberately. I think this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to actually shape and not just administer what somebody else has built. And so, money and the reflections of money are a big part of that. So I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Wonderful. So I'm going to poke you first with a few personal questions. And the first one is really, what did you learn about money as you were growing up? So what was your personal background with money?
So first of all, I come from an area in Germany that's similar to the Scottish, known for its austerity. So I come from the south, from the Swabian area. But when we first discussed that question earlier, I was one thing that actually came to my mind, and I thought, this is always a good idea. The one thing that comes to your mind first is probably the one you should be sharing, as it's the most personal. I remember that because I was living close to both the Austrian border and the Swiss border. So where I grew up, it's just, close to both of those countries. And back then we didn't have the euro. We had shilling in Austria and we had the Swiss franc, as we still do in Switzerland. And I remember just, thinking when we were, going across the border, that it's so weird that everything else in shilling was ×7 back then. So, if you were to order, I don't know, just a regular portion of French fries, it would be something like, I don't know, 35 shilling, and it would be maybe, 3 Swiss franc, and back then it would be maybe, 2 Deutschmark. And to me, that just seemed absolutely absurd. I just remember, being a small primary school kid, I just couldn't understand how the same thing, had so awkwardly different numbers. And of course, growing up, the number is what mattered, not the unit. So to me, that was probably one of my, first intriguing leads into why I was, appalled to learn about the competition of monies, i.e., foreign exchange rates. So that, I think, is one of the stories that, shaped my thinking about money early on.
I muted myself because of the cough. And when you look at that, and you already said it shaped you in some shape or form to see how money is apparently not, or how worth is ascribed is not just one thing. How would you say does that filter into your experience and your thinking today, that it's not always the same thing, even though theoretically it could be a sandwich could always cost €6, but it doesn't?
Well, I think to me, it's a very apparent concept that money, or fiat money, as in the blockchain community, we would like to, we call what others, perceive as the real money. So, state issued money is very much a thing of competition. And I think for a long time, the state was the only power that could actually facilitate a wide issuance of money. And I think that's a paradigm that technology, as so many others, has overruled. So you don't need a state to issue a currency, or better said, a means of payment. And I think it leads us to 3 questions that are, worthwhile exploring. One, why and how is money being issued in the first place? So whose purpose does it serve? And second of all, how do we exchange value? And thirdly, why and how do we issue and use means of payment? And all those 3 are similar yet different. And I think it's the differences, that leave room for technological improvements, for reflections and understanding of how things work and interact. And so that's certainly something that I feel passionate about, and it's something that sparks my curiosity.
Mm-hmm. And when you take what you just shared with me, Katharina, how does that affect a dream or vision you have for the world?
I do think that there is a level of transparency and honesty in this conversation to be had. And it's very much one that I would think is a new era of enlightenment. I do think that it's a little bit like the Bible has been translated from Latin and ancient Greek into German, and people can actually, read for themselves and ask questions for themselves, and just, be independent in their formation of an opinion and a view, and, use reason to reflect on the structures. And I do think that, this is something where we need to just all ask ourselves, how is this thing called money influencing our life, and not just our life on a personal level, but also the community level. And, it's driving the economy, and it's driving all our livelihoods. It's another form of a power structure. And to me, I just have a very non-ideological, very observant, also from my heritage as an economist type of view. And I just find it intriguing because, we all use it every day, and it seems to be one of the things that we almost know, very little about.
Yeah, absolutely, which is one of the reasons why we are talking here today. And I'm so delighted to have you as a guest. Katharina, you are a big expert for token economy and blockchain. And before we get into blockchain, can you briefly explain what is meant by token economy, just in case somebody here doesn't quite have their bearings in this field?
Sure. And I would actually, take the time, given that, Ivan isn't with us, I would actually, spend 2 or 3 sentences more on it. So generally, if we look at the technological evolutions, it's important to understand that all of these new shapes and forms are, just an continuation of previous technologies and previous ways of, exchanging information and exchanging value. So when we look at the internet, what today we would call, the Web 1.0, we had this framework. There were browsers all of a sudden. There were HTML files, and you could do web pages with that, and you could upload those to a server, and then somebody else could see it. And there was this whole thing moving us from a paper-based information sharing model also to, something that started to be on our screens, globally shared, and there was a whole impact of that. But back then in the early 90s, people really didn't know yet what it was. There was this framework, and there, those tools started to emerge. And those tools emerged, but also other restrictions came apparent. And it was one that digital files are easy to be copyable, right? We all, know the Napster story. And there was a question about, well, how can we share, but also ensure data integrity at the same time? So, we have the Web 2.0, which was the whole social media and interacting net. And now we have the Web 3.0. And that's the internet of value. So it's not the internet of information like the Web 1. It isn't the information at the web of the network, which is Web 2, but it's the internet of value. That's the Web 3. And now token economy is really ahead of us, just like the internet era was in the 90s. So we know there's a thing called token, just like we know that there was a thing called the HTML file. And we know there's a thing like the blockchain, similar to there is this thing called the World Wide Web. And to us, I think the intriguing question is, where does this lead? Our vision and our understanding at this point is that it leads to the token economy. So the data will have a value, and that value can be transferred and shared and created in new ways and distributed in new ways. So very much like we got used to using email instead of formal letters, I'm convinced that we will be using tokens just like we did emails. And so it will be the normal means to transfer value.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk about tokens, give us a more concrete idea what is meant by transferring tokens.
Mm-hmm. So a token, very much like a web page, is a form and is a digital type, is a file type, if you so want, one that has a clear identity, a timestamp, and thereby a data integrity. And the token is really an application that runs on the blockchain, again, a little bit like the web page on the internet. And the token includes an asset. Now, there are legal jurisdictions such as Liechtenstein, where you already have a token law and a concept like the token container. And in Germany, right now, you still require a piece of paper if you want to issue a security. Now, the token will really, substitute the traditional paper-based security as we know it. It could be applied to an equity share. It could be applied to a bond. It could be applied to represent a commodity, but it also can be a usage right, or it also can be an underlying payment stream. It can be many different forms, just like the web page can. So I think it's important to understand that it's a category, a tool, a framework, more than there isn't one type of token. And I think here it's really also up to the creativity and competition in this world to define what everything can be developed from that tool set.
Mm-hmm. So if I understand that correctly, then a token is a form of a container, and what the content of the container is up for debate, or is part of our creative process in a way.
Yes, in a way, yes. And there's some that will use the container shape as part of their business model, and some that will just be a wrapper. And again, it's a little bit like the web page. At first, you maybe just displayed a picture, and then at some point, people made a business out of displaying pictures, and called it YouTube, and even had it moving around. So here, just because there's the tool, some find a purpose in the tool itself, and some will just use the tool as a messenger. And I think, right now we see a lot of the messenger application, and we see emerging, models that actually use the tokens as their business model as such. And to me, it's, it just sparks my interest and my curiosity to see, which ones apply the token in the one way and which ones in, let's say, the more advanced, newer business model type way.
Mm-hmm. Which also means that there is no inherent value from a sense of ethical values connected to this. It can be used like a hammer to destroy something potentially, even, or to build something. It's a tool that you can use.
Yeah, it's a representation, if you so will. It's a digital representation that can't be copied, and it will be stored on something where the big benefit is that you have a transparency, and that transparency will last. If you upload a web page today, and it represents something that you would perceive as negative, and tomorrow you could upload something and that you represent or perceive as positive. And you wouldn't really have a track record unless you've taken a picture on your phone on what happened yesterday. So, there's always a potential, not a given, but there's a potential for fraud. And using blockchain as an infrastructure, as an immutable record of whatever else and whatever happened previously, just gives a sense of liability and transparency that I personally very much appreciate, because it, gives me and myself the opportunity to check and verify without needing to trust a third party or an intermediate.
Mm-hmm. So let's look at one of the specific applications of this methodology or this technology. And you were talking about that you don't particularly feel that you are an expert for cryptocurrencies, but you can talk a little bit about it, because that might be one of the ways that most people here in this room have come in touch with this technology already.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So and I also see a question in the chat, so I'll come back to that in a question. So let's differentiate for the moment between a coin and a token in the sense that I've just described. Okay. In the terminology that I would apply, a blockchain such as the Bitcoin blockchain or another blockchain such as the Ethereum blockchain will have a native coin. And the native coin will be the Bitcoin for Bitcoin and Ether for Ethereum, right? And so other blockchains such as Polkadot and so on and so forth will have their own coin. Now, the Bitcoin blockchain is the oldest one. On Ethereum blockchain is really the one that introduced the concept of tokens and decentralized applications, and is more a platform also for tokens. So I think that's the bridge and the framework within to allocate what I just earlier said about tokens. And if people sometimes think about cryptocurrencies, the most popular and still also in terms of market capitalization, biggest one is of course Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is very much dominating the discussion around the whole cryptocurrency and token space. And to me, it sparks the memory of when I first, lived in the States and the internet was coming. Then everybody was using AOL, and the AOL Messenger was the thing, and everybody had an AOL email, and that was like the main used page. And you could really, Google wasn't around, so you really didn't find anything else, or you weren't used to remembering www.something.com. And interestingly enough, it's a little bit like Bitcoin now, right? So it's the one part that is dominating in the perception of the crowd. So it's almost became a pars pro toto for the whole concept. But it is important to understand that there are many more blockchains out there. It's an growing technology space. There are very different applications. It's a question if it's a private blockchain or a public blockchain. If you know who the original software developer is or not. And there are many different, distinctive governance questions also around cryptocurrencies and blockchain. But if we all understand that there is a big plethora of applications and use cases and blockchains, then we're all a very big step ahead.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested, Katharina, if you could maybe give a few examples, because it's my understanding that one of the things that can be done with a cryptocurrency that is based on blockchain is to actually reinforce target behavior. Yeah, so something that we want to see more of? So, for example, there's some social coins now that are trying to work on that premise to actually further a type of behavior they would like to see or like to strengthen in a particular community. And I'm wondering, are there any examples that you could share with us where you're aware of that and how that works?
Mm-hmm. So I think the fundamental first part of that is that part of the blockchain technology is a core feature called decentralization. So I think overall there is a whole idea about the community versus the individual or an individual entity. And having said that, the original idea of Bitcoin was one of a peer-to-peer cashless payment system. So also here, the peer-to-peer part, regardless of a central organizing authority, whether it be a bank or whether it be a state, was important. And to large parts of the original blockchain and Bitcoin community, it still is. Having said that, there have been models, and they have also different organizational models, governance models, such as the decentralized autonomous organization, that DAOs, and there has been an application such as the Fair token, Fair coin. There's Fair token and there's Fair coin, but I mean Fair coin. That tries to develop a transparent and decentralized world, and in everything. Where we see the merge is, Green Power, the Energy Web Foundation, I think is probably the most prominent, and from a global perspective, the application with the biggest reach. The different other, let's say green power, carbon credit certificate applications out there that then are strongly associated with the parts of sustainability and environmental issues. But I think overall, the platform has three big advantages that also help social communities. One, it's really, a low-cost effort. You don't really need to program a software because you use the blockchain. You have a framework, a little bit like WordPress for homepages now, where you can use the language of the Ethereum blockchain to create a token. So, it's very easy to use, and it's quite an effortless exercise. There are initiatives such as the Ocean Protocol or others that, also have been designed to share data. There's been, quite an array and different approaches to defining, new ways for a community to work together or to share information or to share value. And I think, it just gives, and it has a higher security, of course. So, I think it allows people to, reflect and think about governance structures, about ownership structures, about usability structures. And it just, again, like the webpage reference, it just gives you a new way to express yourselves and to communicate and to find an agreement. And, therefore, there's a lot of new aspects that can be built upon.
So, when we dig deeper into those new aspects that you were just mentioning, what would you say then, what the impact is that this technology will have on money and business as a whole? What do you see in the future?
I'm not a radical person, and yet I do see the radicality or the radicalness of the whole changes. It's a fundamental paradigm shift. I do think that we see an era come to an end that will, impact the way that businesses work. It will impact the perception of labor. It will impact the perception of money and of states. So, now that we're focusing on the topic of money here, as I said earlier, the whole idea is money is also a good that is in the competition to other goods. Right now, we have around 150 nation states that are issuing one way or the other a currency. And we already see that in this current competition, the US dollar, still has a dominant position, but it doesn't really reflect the overall underlying real GDP dominance than it did back in the 1970s when Bretton Woods was around. So I do think with the global power shift between, the rise of China and, the actual real GDP impact that China now has on the global economy compared to the US is obviously one of the big driving factors. but also, you know, the question of states who, for whatever reason, you know, see a massive increase of inflation or value loss depending on which part of the coin you have. So that's, you know, let's say Turkey, let's say Venezuela, let's say Argentina. We have states that for political reasons are somewhat cut off, you know, Iran, North Korea. So in this global competition of money right now, from a European perspective, from a Western-centric perspective, you know, it's hard to understand, and I feel that, you know, on a global agenda, also when we talk about these issues in the World Economic Forum or at the Munich Security Conference, and people are way more perceptive to the advantages that technology has, because they're not used to being paid and pay in euro. And they're, you know, used to think also in parallel to in the US dollar compared to their own currency. And they do face, you know, high payment and transaction cost when, for example, you know, sending money from developed Western worlds to other parts of this world where the payment infrastructure isn't the same as here. But they all still have a mobile phone. They can participate in, you know, the bigger, wider mobile economy. So for them, really, and particularly in the whole Southeast Asian region, you know, we see a exponential growth of adoption. And, you know, if you have a choice now and it's more convenient, it's safer, and it's actually more reliable than your actual, you know, national currency, then of course, you know, there's a big push towards those new technologies. And I think it's here, you know, good to once, you know, step out of our own direct world and just reflect for how many billions of people this is a lasting and positive impact on their personal livelihood.
Yeah. And, you know, from a personal example, I have a friend from Venezuela who lives here in Berlin, and blockchain technology using Bitcoins has been the one way for him to actually send money to his parents, because nothing else works anymore. And so it was quite interesting for me to see that in action, right? To see how that became the lifeline between his account and, you know, somebody there who would then transfer the money into something they can use in stores there. But that was the way to actually help them, to support them. I'm wondering, with what you just talked about, though, what is your what do you see in terms of how governments respond to this, right? Because there's also a bit of in this democratization that is inherent in the technology and the accessibility and the fact that it's becoming more and more mainstream. I would assume there's also a bit of a risk, at least for those governments who are not so interested in these kind of developments. What do you see there on a political stage?
I think it's one where we need to very carefully dissect the different stakeholders in their actual role. We do, you know, as a first starting point, I would like to differentiate between, you know, those citizens living in a democracy and enjoying, you know, this type of voting and government producing system on an abstract level, and the actual power holders, you know, that are either elected officials or ones that represent the executive or subsequent institutions, you know, let's say, for example, the BaFin in Germany and other institutions that are not directly, you know, associated with an elected government body, but, you know, represent some form of power structure. And to me, when I refer to enlightenment, I also refer to the fact that we can have a different view and we can have a different approach to how, you know, we want to facilitate living together peacefully, and how do we actually structure and come up, you know, with a sensible mean of living together that, one, is efficient, and you know, and I mean efficient in a way of how do we actually improve the life quality of the users. And I'm not saying citizens, I'm saying the user of a state institution, and how is it on the transactional level to live in that particular state. And not only Corona, but everything from, how does a registration process work when you move? How is it to set up a company? What happens if you need to pay a bill for, the tax for your dog, or what, there's so many interaction points with the state where I think most would agree the user experience isn't the same as when you use, well-developed online booking or online consumption services. And really the question comes down to why, when people experience the one service level on this side, the other one in the end is also a service we pay for, and we make choices. There are opportunity costs to the services being where they are. They're both on each of us on a personal level. What do I do with my time? But of course, they're also on a community level. So how much do those services cost, and what else could we pay or afford if those services would be done in a different way? And I see that half cynically, and I also say that, quite loudly. I've been quoted at a different point saying, no taxation without tokenization. And what I mean by that is there's an inherent freedom and an inherent fairness in automation that many in the state and in modern democracies don't really acknowledge. And I think that's unfair. And it's unfair also to a younger generation, because we do see that, the big electoral votes in, the Western states across Europe, but also America, are determined by an electorate that is, determined by voters 60 years and above. And I'm not meaning to age discriminate. I'm just saying the current political stakeholders are more prone to appeal to a larger and mostly older electoral. But the bills we're paying and the ones who are actually living this life in this state right now, whose children are attending school, who are, working, who are trying to create business, who are trying to service the community. Even when you run a social impact Verein here in Germany, so an association, the bureaucratic burden and, the tax declarations, if you want to be what we call here gemeinnützig, and I'm not actually quite sure what the actual literal text translation would be for gemeinnützig, but you actually want to do something, even if you just want to, service your neighborhood. And so I do think there's a level of bias and discrimination in this whole era where, technology as such automates services, but also is the institutionalized fairness. And I think that that's a discussion we don't have enough, and money is just one shape or form. And I think it's a big one, of course, but it's just one shape or form in that discussion.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's obviously so much to unpack, so I'm pretty sure that people in a moment will have questions for you, at least I hope so. But one of the things that I want to pick out there is, I remember in one of your articles, you actually wrote about that in a way it's easier to reduce loss than to make a profit. And you were referencing also how much the bureaucratic apparatus that we have, at least in Germany, very strongly, as you were just sharing about how complicated everything is, from registering a company to paying taxes, even if it's for the common good and nobody actually wants to make any money with it. It's a near impossibility, it sometimes appears to me. So that is costing a lot of money, and that might potentially not be necessary if we did it in a different way. So what do you see there, and who do you think might not be interested in that kind of a future, if anybody?
Yeah. So I think when we afford ourselves to go on an abstract level and ask a very fundamental question, then the question really becomes is, how is a citizen in a state, perceived, and what is the core of his identity? Right now, the state on the communal, on the federal, on the country level provides a lot of services, but also asks for a lot of duties. And although I'm, quite educated and I run businesses and I am a mother and I'm trying to be, very much on top of things, there's a point where I never feel I can do the right thing because I might be missing something. Do I miss a deadline? Should I have paid something? Should I have voted somewhere because I want to vote and I want to exercise my rights to vote? So the whole organization of institutions that we have has become very complicated. And I'm still just the same person, but there is no record of me as an interacting part with the community, okay? So the question is really, who is setting the expectation, and how is the communication between, let's say, the state as a collective on the different levels of institutions and myself? And I think one of the key questions is really also when we, think about data privacy in its core, and about, freedoms, and about, the key identity, and also the protection that an individual is granted with the articles in our constitutions. Then really the big question has become, what right more does a state have than to once identify me in the most safest way possible?
Which,
and how
mean
much
what?
And that in that case would be a blockchain-based identity that I own, that not the state owns, that I own. The only thing, somebody needs to know that there is a digital identity of a person, and there's this actual, distance between me and myself and the life I live, but there's a connection. There's a way to communicate with me, and everything that's related to me, everything that you expect me to do, to pay, or to not do, this is the way to communicate without me, needing to disclose where I live, without me needing to disclose my gender, without me, opening myself up to the biases of this world. And I think that's just another way, an alternate way to look at that. And just as much, as we didn't declare ourselves the subjects of someone, I think there's been a certain level of subjectization by the state and its institutions. And I think, when we all want to be on top of our own identity and our underlying freedoms, then I think, that is really the level of protection that I would want, and that the state could provide by blockchain.
Mm-hmm. And can you contrast that to, what we're seeing, for example, in China right now, where there's also this air of, well, everything is incredibly transparent. How is that different, this vision, from what we're experiencing there?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very valuable question. I think that's that's even a bigger misunderstanding than everything on the blockchain is money laundering. And there is, when I just said, it's my identity and I own the identity, okay, then that's exactly where the Chinese approach couldn't be any different, because it's the state grants you an identity, it gives you a wallet, it designates a wallet to you and uses this to collect data about you. So in the underlying paradigm, you're just a part of a sum, and you're part of a network, and we can associate everything to you and link everything to you, and by that make you transparent in an incredibly thorough way. What I'm talking about is exactly the opposite. There's only one time the acknowledgement that I am me, right? I'm not a fraud, and the whole concept of I need to be accountable for what I do, but everything else is owned and controlled by me, not by a state, not by a group, not by somebody else.
To make it concrete, if I would, let's say, go into a store and buy a new computer and do that with a cryptocurrency, whatever currency I would end up using, where would that information then go?
Mm-hmm. So in the concept that I'm talking about, owning my identity, the one thing that somebody else who's transacting with me only needs to know is this a real verified identity? And I don't, like, that other person isn't entitled to know who I am, or where I live, or what I do, or which credit card I paid for, right? It only needs to know, is this a verified, credible transaction partner? Yes or no? Okay. The second question is, for whatever that verified identity did or did not do, has it the means to pay? And it doesn't matter, does she have more? Does she just have that? Does she borrow it or not? Is it a credit card or a bank account? All that information is already actually giving too much. Is it a verified identity? Can she execute that transaction? 2 yes or no questions. Mm-hmm. That's it. Okay. Mm-hmm. The rest is on me. Mm-hmm. If I choose to give more information, then I can, but I don't need to. In the other system, it's very much a different one, right? It's okay. It's one used where the whole scoring concept comes into play. So we offer you everything we know about this person. It is a person. It's a social security number. That's where she works. That's, you know, where her, that's how many kids she has. That's, you know, her marital status and all these things. And we'll use this and, you know, offer you then a customized service. Now, what I would say in the concept that I do, well, if I want to share and if I want to have a customized service, and if I like that, you know, things fill out for me without me needing to do them, then I can, you know, click that and accept that. Mm-hmm. But the first and fundamental value is I own it. It's my choice. And if I choose not to, then actually the whole idea of data privacy and only then is achieved, because even in our current system, and that's, I think, also one where we're way more closer to the Chinese model than we right now think, and the whole, you know, data privacy discussion in Germany, I think, misleads strongly. There is no data privacy right now, right? The internet is an open book. Most of us use smartphones, and even those that don't use smartphones can be profiled based on where you are and who you interact with, okay? So because there is this open information and also information that is valid on, let's say, only 3-4 character traits or data attributes, as we would say in the world that I live in, I can find everything about you, Nadezhda. I would pretty much know you're female. I would roughly be knowing where you live. I, knew if you were like a book person just from the look, there's too much contextual information out in this world that we can reference, that we can tag, that we can use for other alternative analyses. And so the whole concept of blockchain is I give you the least you need to know to transact with me. So you have security, and that's the only right you're entitled to. And everything else is my choice.
Well, I must say that, sounds in a way quite wonderful, but it also means there's a different level of responsibility or willingness to be not always as comfortable, I guess, that I would need to agree to. Because right now, paying, Apple has my thumbprint. When I pay with my phone, that happens in a moment. If I fill out a form with my phone, as you said, it's already pre-filled out with all the necessary information. So it seems to me that right now there's also a bit of a battle between how comfortable and easy do I want to be versus how much protection do I feel I deserve in my identity. What's your view on that?
Well, I think the question you're answering is going to a transactional level. And I think we came, from the abstract level of, what should be the underlying agreement. It's very much like, what's the collective bargain that they did back in, the early 1800s. And I think that we need to do again. So first of all, it's like, who owns an identity and what is the purpose of a state? Now, if you want to have the filled out form, and, I pay by Apple Watch, but it's a choice of mine, and that's important, is I choose what part of my identity is revealed. Because even if you pay with the Apple Watch, even if you choose to disclose that information, the thing is, again, can that be used to score? Because it's a collected and gathered pool of information, or at this point in time in the mechanism is called the zero knowledge proof. Did you decide to not do zero knowledge proof, but maybe 1 or 2 knowledge proof, meaning you shared 1 or 2 more knowledge pieces about yourself, okay? So I think in the whole also political sense, and again, money sense, we don't want to be controlled and we don't want to be steered. So we need to take the responsibility of the choice. I'm not saying you shouldn't have the comfort, not at all. I'm a convenient person. I live on efficiency, but it's a choice. And I think, just that moment. And again, whose fault is it if I don't know which tax bill to pay? I have a master's degree in finance. I worked in a bank. I run companies, and I don't feel I can do my tax return myself. How are others feeling? And then we're punishing them for missing a deadline, and we're charging them, absurd interest rates. There's just this whole idea of whose fault is it really? Are we just organized, in a shitty way? or is it really on the person who, wasn't wasn't fulfilling what he was required to do? And I think if you look at the whole concept of money is strongly used to punish people and to incentivize people. But then again, what is the way to really live right, and what is the real way to do it correctly? And in the end, right, I think there's actually there's a liability on the state to reach out to me when I need to do something. It's not the other way around.
Yes, I would love to, live in that reality that you're describing there, Katharina. What this also brings up for me, though, is also the question of who holds the power right now. Because what I'm seeing is that I would probably argue that for a lot of big companies, the data that I'm giving so easily is, that's worth a lot of money, right? So I'm wondering who might push against that, and what can we do about that on a political level, and maybe also what have been the conversations you've been a part of when we challenge that pull to power, that pull to knowledge that they have about all of these willing citizens that give up this, this great information about what they like and what size jeans they wear and where they want to holiday.
Yeah, I took the liberty to directly answer you in the chat, but of course I'll also say it here. If you want to get and gain the rewards of your own data and of your surfing behavior, use the Brave browser. It rewards you basic attention tokens, which means you're being paid for the basic attention you provide by using a service or looking at a thing. Okay. So I think the good news is there are tools like that, and blockchain technology actually enables that. I think, obviously there's always the resistance and the laziness in our habits that, refine us most of the time to just repeating what we've always done. But we do have a tool, and we do have an alternative now. And I think, those who feel strongly about that, have a chance to choose other options. And we're trying to push for the self-sovereign identity on the European level, on the German level. I think it's a really important task for all of us to not end up just having the Chinese model or having the American model. I think both of those models are really not in line with at least my personal values, or what I would perceive as the European values of independence and liberty, and like true independence and data privacy. But in the end, there are other tools, and we talk about money again, and those basic attention tokens you can change into cryptocurrencies token, or in the end, if you want euro, US dollars, and then that's an additional income you probably didn't expect.
Okay. And maybe a final question from my end before I would like to hand over to the room and see what has come up for everybody listening. In a way, what you described is, truly a consciousness shift, right? And you called it an enlightenment in some shape or form, because it really requires that we begin to think about how do we best organize democracy? Whose responsibility is what in a system that works, it creates well-being and creates efficiency for everybody. This may be a strange question for you, I don't know, but I feel compelled to ask it because of what I do in life. What do you feel is the need or the value of inner work, sort of consciousness development, in order to be able to foresee and envision and be part of this kind of a new reality? Do you see a connection there at all, or do you go, I don't have any idea what you're talking about?
Well, I think I see where you're coming from, and I think the angle that I would take is one, I think that has to do probably from the terminology that I would use is reflection and mindfulness, and just, being aware of the fact that we live in a system that somebody else has built. Just because the system has been, around for a significant amount of time now, and even the generation of our parents have been growing up in the system, it's still a man-made human system, right? The whole monetary system, the whole political system is a institution that we've decided to be like that. And I think when you think about inner work, I think the one question is how much of a acceptor and how much of a maker or creator are we? I think that does have to do with inner work in the end, because it's the freedom to operate and to think and about challenging it. And I think when I look at my own life, I consider myself to be a curious, engaged person. I'm not expecting anything from anyone else, not from life. I expect it to come from me. I expect myself to create, to live the best version of myself, and to come up with my own ideas and insights. And so I think, depending on what's your starting point, mine is one, I'm driven to understand. It's a passion of myself to not just accept something as a fact. And so, maybe that's the part of my inner journey that I can share.
Yeah, thank you, Katharina. I think that's very, very helpful. And because, when I listen to people like you who are sort of so entrenched in new technologies and looking at how they can be used to redesign systems that we've come to accept as a law of nature when they're really not. I keep coming back to the observation that what we're facing right now is really not a technical or technological challenge, because the technology to have a different world is already out there in a myriad of different realms. We have amazing technologies that could probably fix most of the damage we've already inflicted on the planet. But the reason we don't is because it's a human challenge, right? Because the reason why we're not acting, why we're not reflecting, using our mindfulness, using our ability to choose, that is deeply rooted in our psychology. And that's where I feel the inner work piece plays a huge role, actually, in a potential new future. Katharina, thank you so much, firstly, for this part of the interview. And now we've already had a number of different questions. And also, I'd love to actually hear from some of you. So what we're going to do is Marcus unpinning us as speakers so that we see more of you. So if you were so inclined to turn on your camera, that would be great. Mark, right now, I still see Katharina as pinned, I think, or maybe it's just my view. Sorry, I have speaker view. Okay, not your fault, my fault. Yeah, so if you could turn on your cameras, that would be fantastic. And then if you want to raise your hand, Mark, could you walk people through how to raise their hand electronically, please?
Sure. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you have a button that says reactions. It's a little smiley face with a little plus. If you click on that, you should have a button that says raise hand, and then we'll see it. Fantastic.
And we already have one hand up, and I will give first right to people who actually raise their hand, because I think it's the more interesting conversation. And then if people are too shy, I will also read some of the questions from the chat. And maybe just one word, I would like to assure you there are no stupid questions, right? I'm pretty sure that Katharina is used to environments where not everybody is operating on her level of understanding of the subject matter, like me. And it doesn't matter. Like, if we want to educate ourselves around this topic, we need to dare to look stupid and make a fool of ourselves with dumb questions. So I'm encouraging all of us to ask as many dumb questions as we can think of. So Nicolas, if you would unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Katharina. I was wondering, people speak about Bitcoin blockchain eating a lot of energy. And I have the feeling that it also gives a lot of services very smoothly. So in your opinion, how is the trade-off between the energy it consumes and all the services that are offered?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Nicolas, for this question. And let me take the opportunity to clarify a few things, right? Bitcoin blockchain is the oldest blockchain around, and it used the proof of work consensus, which is one of very high energy consumption. However, it also produces the Bitcoins, and there's a differentiation between production of the Bitcoins, a process called mining, and then the actual usage, okay? And it is transparent and open in a way because you can actually add up the production and the usage and the running of the network. Those are the three energy consuming parts. When you look at the current payment system, then there is really no angle to actually come up with the energy consumption neither of producing cash, credit cards, or the whole, let's say, payment infrastructure, nor what does it cost to electronically save your transaction on at least 17 different servers, because you have the receiving bank, the sending bank, the banks in between, the transaction network, etc., etc. So as long as we don't have transparency on what really the overall energy consumption of the network, the transaction, and the producing of money is compared to Bitcoin, I think it's a question where we always need to be quite careful. However, using less energy is always better. So I'm a big fan personally of the proof of stake blockchain, which is now being used going forward with Ethereum and with newer blockchains, where we have a significant lower energy consumption. And I think it's very fair to say, although it's one that no scientific assay has yet been able to prove, assuming that Bitcoin is already overall the less energy consuming way to pay, Ethereum for sure is, because it only uses a fraction of the energy that Bitcoin does. So I think if we want to have the transparency and are willing to accept the transparency about what energy consumption is, then blockchain itself is a good technology to use. And B, if we're all in a combined effort to use less energy, then proof of stake blockchains are really the much better way to go.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nicola, for the question. And Laura, you were the first one to actually type a question in the chat, and you have your hand up, so I would ask you to unmute yourself.
Hi, good morning, Nadia and Katharina. Thank you so much for letting me talk to you. It's the early morning in Vancouver, BC, Canada. Yeah, I have a lot to learn. And my first question was about the NFT and just what I was looking at. And it kind of struck me, is this a type of token? But I have a part B question that I wanted to ask you to speak more about. You see the change happening in employment, and I'd like to hear more about that too. Thank you.
Okay, so NFT is the abbreviation for non-fungible tokens, and it got hyped recently, by a big art sale, and it's now being used to, distribute everything from songs or industrial IP rights. And it's the whole idea that in the Internet of Value, as I described earlier, you now also have, individual assets that in itself are unique, and by its uniqueness have a quality in itself and a value. They're a little bit different from the tokens that I'm using, because they're meant to be replicated. They're not meant to be only associated with an individual data point. And I'm not saying that NFTs don't have value, but they're really only one small piece of the puzzle when you think about a token economy concept, because token economy is much more transactional, right? It isn't just to differentiate what's yours and what's mine. It's meant to let us operate just like apps on a smartphone do, for example, okay? So I think it's one of, let's say, the interpretations of the whole web page analogy that I heard earlier. So somebody decided, okay, we can do identifiable web pages that can have a clear ownership, for example, me versus Laura, or the other way around. So it's an interesting concept. I'm personally not a particular fan of the hype it's creating, because again, it is focusing the short-term application over the overall potential technology. And I think we're from a generation that we've learned how internet has shaped and transformed our lives, and mobile. Aren't we in a position now to ask fundamental questions first before we're driven by individual applications that create a hype? So I'm always trying to argue, let's think about the broader implications, about the paradigm shift, not just about, the individual application. But NFTs are to be seen in that regard. And sorry, the second question was, I lost my thought. What was the other thing?
Oh no, that was terrific answer. Employment. You said you see a shift in the future regarding employment, and I would love to hear more about that. Thank you.
Yes. So I think to most people offering labor, let's say on a global market, they've needed and corporate to be able to monetize their services or skills, right, in a broader sense. Now, with the token economy, they're really new business models. So if you're the one who creates a token, you don't need a big corporation to run that. You can update that, you can change that, you can claim ownership, or you don't. I think everybody that works in the creative industries, everybody that participates in a global market, they have a broader market to offer service, they have a easier market to access, and they have significantly less barriers to entry, be it from a legal part, being it from a how to access a client part, and so forth and so forth. So I do think that you know, the way how you can monetize your skills, your time, your efforts are completely changed by the token economy itself. And why I was double checking if I heard employment right, then I probably, you know, should reconsider using the word employment and changing really to labor. Because one of the underlying fundamental assumptions of money in itself is that it is a means to pay your time and your efforts, i.e. labor. So I'm just saying we need to rethink our model also here, because, you know, it'll be different. There won't be the same security, but there also won't be the same dependency as we see right now.
Great, thank you. Laura, does this answer the questions you had?
Yes, that you're right. It is labor was the word that, yeah, great catch. Thank you, Katharina. That was wonderful. I'm really enjoying this. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Laura. And I'm so jealous that you're walking through the forest in Vancouver. It's amazing. It's one of my favorite places. So I'm going to ask you some questions from the chat that actually came in via YouTube, because there are a number of viewers that can't directly interact with us. So one question was, I find that fascinating to hear that blockchain is immune against fraud. And where do we store all that data? And if it's stored on servers, can they not be destroyed and then the data is lost?
Okay, great question. I at some point I will really need to find out who I'm currently citing. I just know that it's been a journalist from the Deutschlandfunk, which was one of the, you know, big. It's almost like a bit like, you know, the NPR in America. So one of the journalists talking about blockchain found a great picture. And it's like, if you look at the security of electronically stored files on a centralized server versus a decentralized server, the centralized server is the shape and the size of one little, you know, sand corn at the beach, and a decentralized way to store data is the size of the Earth, okay, the planet Earth. So I think the first thing that I need to say, there is no absolute security. Electronically shared data, just like paper shared data or things in your head, can be lost. There is no absolute security. But if we choose to save data, then a centralized system will not be as safe as a decentralized system. And why? Because if you, for example, look at the Ethereum blockchain today, we have more than 35 million different nodes. So let's say little roots of this network, and you would need to destroy all of them to really eliminate all the records. Now they're all differently encrypted. So if you would want to steal or hack or change the data, you would need to attack the majority of the network within a little time frame of maybe 6 to 8 seconds, simultaneously change the record going backwards, which is also protected by something called the Merkle tree. And only then could you change it. Now, that means, you know, it's just also from an economic perspective, but just from a level of complexity, so much more unlikely. And it's really the idea of probability that you would want to look at in those things rather than absolute terms. So it's very much more unlikely to have it hacked or changed or stolen.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question from YouTube. What, you know, and sometimes we need to fill in the gaps a little bit, because obviously we can't really ask any question back, but what are the shifts in education that are required for this new reality in which, for example, governance is built on blockchain? How can schools that are state-based cater to this?
schools in itself are such a difficult topic these days. Sorry, it's really hard for me to come up with a spontaneous great answer, other than I think the key question is which part of the game do schools want to play in the future, right? Are we really sticking to a class teacher content type model? And I think that's even as fundamental as I would go right now. So schools, to me, particularly right now in this time, are a very difficult subject to reply to. And I think I need to refrain from giving an answer here.
Yeah, you have children, right? So you're a particular victim of current circumstances. So another question from YouTube. When I observe the macrocosmos around and the microcosmos inside of me, I discover a lot of exchanges and connections, and everything flows without money or any kind of currency. Why do we need money at all?
I would refer back to what I said earlier, that it is actually the time where people will start asking these questions. And typically textbook-like, you would say there are three means or three reasons for money, means of payment, store of value, and creating a relationship between individuals and the state and its citizens to pay taxes. I think the short answer is we do have a technology now where if somebody who is inclined to ask these questions can think about how this technology can substitute what traditionally we think of money. Will we always have some kind of means of exchange? Yes, I do so, because we're not all producing their own food and we're not just consuming what we produce with our own hands. So, even social interaction, you could say dopamine is a currency in itself as well, right? Or endorphins. And so I think it really comes to the question how fundamental, but if somebody is really interested in the fundamental questions, I can only recommend to look at Chris Carmeyer's work from Sustaining Capital, because he is asking a lot of fundamental questions about money and do we need money in a blockchain era.
Great. I'd love if you put something in the chat, because I'll be putting together a little email for everybody who is registered afterwards with links that might be of interest. And as you are typing, I see that Carsten has his hand up. So Carsten, if you could unmute yourself.
Thank you, Nadia. Hi, Katharina. Nadia said a little while ago how all the technology we need to change things is already there. And like we're working on a project to do that in physical places, building elegant villages where you can bring all of that together. And of course, we're also looking, at blockchain and holochain specifically. So I think doing property agreements on that, we're pretty close to that, or that is already happening. But I'd be really curious to hear your opinion. Like, what's the time frame until you think it's actually going to be possible to run big complex organizations as DAOs? And what do you think is the time frame until we can take ecological value and really turn those into currencies that go adjacent to what's currently considered money?
And Katharina, before you answer, I'm wondering if it might be worth to explain what a DAO is very quickly, Carsten, if you could.
A decentralized autonomous organization. I thought Katharina said that earlier, but I might have imagined that.
She used the word DAO as well, but not everybody might be familiar with the abbreviation. So
an organization that doesn't need big bosses anymore.
That's really looking into the future and only making comments based on assumptions. But I think my general hypothesis is that technology will come, but it surprises you when it comes. I do think that we see a bigger adoption in mobile first economy. So I think the whole adoption in Southeast Asia and Africa is growing at a much higher growth rate. I do think it also depends on how much a legislative reaction is one that forbids things rather than, lets it play in a sandbox environment, for example. And I think we do see, very different stances here across the globe and also the regulatory landscape. To me, I think for some time we will see a parallel system. I think it will neither be, a complete change, just like the radio is still there, although we have TV and although we have Netflix, there's still the radio, okay? So I think the whole transactional view of business will become more fluid, and I think there will be an emergence of DAOs, and then it really, is a question to the resilience of those applications and those services and how long those interests last. Because the other, general observation that we are doing is that, businesses have a shorter tenure, right? And while other big companies have been around for 70, 80 years, I think the average lifespan of an American company now is, something like 8. So, really the whole question is, are we still thinking in the right parameters, right? Or isn't any DAO that's already operating now, a DAO in itself in its own right? And if there are others or not, it doesn't really affect the current DAO. And, there are big complex organizations. I have a tendency to think that they will in itself, overcome and be overruled. But then again, you, for example, have infrastructure companies, such as, energy grid companies, they may still, be around and exist. So I think it won't be an either or. I think it's, we're looking at the ones that excel and that flourish and that develop the model further. And we also have a view on, who is willing to work in that. Because I think, let's not forget, there are people who don't seek the right, they seek the security, they don't, seek transparency, they like the intransparency. So I don't expect this to be like 100% change, but I think for those, wanting to own an identity, and for those who, are not accepting the status quo, they will have a tool to change. And how many of those will follow, I don't know. And I'm really not sure if that is, the actual end goal, or if it's just for those who choose to live differently, they can live differently.
Great. Thank you, Katharina. Actually, we have maybe the last question in the chat, because looking at the clock now, I'm quite happy, Katharina, that we had this time exclusively with you, because it was easy to fill it and we could go on much more. So Paresh is asking, it seems that there are 2 factors that may affect the future of crypto: potential currency demonetization and increasing likelihood of central banks regulation and transparency, ?
I think the whole question about central bank digital currencies, or CDBCs, and I think that's part of where that plays in. So how much of the technology will be adapted by states to really more likely copy the current system just on a blockchain basis versus an actual, systemic change, okay? And I think here again, you really need to differentiate between the currencies that from a rating perspective, for example, are AAA rated, where there is no inherent need to change. And those, as you said earlier, also, Nadia, such as Venezuela, because in Venezuela, the system has already changed. It isn't a question of if and when, and if there's a crisis and people will want to eat, they will change to whatever makes them fed, okay? So, it's a little bit like a push and a pull. I mean, historically wars and pandemics and other catastrophes really led to changes. And right now, it's harder to say, when there is a turning point. I do think, we see exponential growth, we see strong adoption. Part of that adoption is driven by machines, not by people. So I think we also shouldn't forget that this technology is opening up, clients to objects as well as, human beings. And I think, really, I mean, the one key takeaway I'd love all of you to take away is like, we need to change our, state of minds and the frameworks within we think. We are in a new, in a new era, and it is a new field. So there aren't really, boundaries and paradigms set. Of course, we come with a package that we have, but this is really a new, a new way to be created. So, I don't want to limit it to from my subjective perception to say what's going to happen, because all of us will have an individual idea.
Yeah, and Katharina, actually, because there was another question via YouTube, which I would feel would be a wonderful point to end this. And the question is, how do we shift collectively and or institutionally from where we are today with our identities out there presently everywhere in the internet to the vision that you described about having blockchain identities or having a blockchain identity that I actually own? How do we get there?
Well, we're very much on the way, right? So we're trying to drive the European self-sovereign identity services. There are things like the Evan Network, Helix ID, and others that try to develop different models of that. And in the end, right now there is, in the political sphere, the discussion, should we prioritize use case or fundamental systems, right? And obviously it'll be a balance of that, but I do think that self-sovereign identities are a big thing. I would like them to be more political, because I think it's an important societal debate to be had. But there are big projects on its way, and I think even from the European Union down to the Bundeskanzleramt in Germany, so the Chancellor's office, they all are working on this. So it's actually something where, if you want to get involved, there is SSI, self-sovereign identity is the whole program name, and there's much more to be learned about that.
Mm-hmm. Great. So in many ways, it sounds as if, even though I also saw the question of how willing will European governments or any governments really be to actually accept the privacy that cryptocurrency enables. What I'm hearing here, that you are in contact with politicians who are on that path and who are trying to drive projects forward from that kind of a vantage point or understanding.
Yeah.
Okay, so everybody, I do want to honor our time commitment as much as I can. Thank you so much, Katharina. I found this really enlightening, and I will certainly watch my own replay of the conversation we had today. Everybody who's registered for this call will get the recording in your inbox anyway. If you are interested in diving a bit deeper into the what should I say, sort of inner work aspect of money, and really finding what do you need to do, the work that you yourself need to do in order to find value in a different way, to get unblocked in terms of your own relationship to money and become more an agent of choice in your own life, then do join us for CU Money, the program that I mentioned earlier. So if you are up for that, I would love to see you there. Otherwise, we'll have more money talks in the future coming up. So Katharina, again, thank you so much. This was a delight, and I hope to see you again soon.
You're very welcome. Thank you, everybody. And wherever you're on this planet, enjoy the rest of this day, how young or how old it may be.
And let's do one final closing ritual. Those of you who are with us more often know this. Please unmute yourself so that we can create a little bit of noise in the ether and not feel like we're so isolated here. And then if you want to wave and say goodbye from wherever you're dialing in from, that would be amazing. So goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Katharina from Brussels. Thank you, Nadia from Brussels.
Brussels here too.